Hey everyone, a quick word before we start the show to say a huge thank you for tuning in and for your ongoing support of Looking Outside over the last few years. If you do enjoy the program and you get value out of it, please take a second to give it a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you tune in. Subscribe to the YouTube channel or give it a like. It truly makes a huge difference to get the algorithm to get it in front of more people. And it means a lot to me. So thanks for tuning in. Keep the feedback coming and enjoy the show.
A lot of the value creation opportunities are going to come not from things that you can measure and understand today, but things that are emergent. The intersection of fields that don't have a name, that don't have competitors, that don't have a market share, that can't be measured and understood. You look at a trend report and you're looking at a rearview mirror. But these emergent fields didn't even exist some time ago.
Hey there, welcome back to Looking Outside. Today we're going to talk about value creation and financial investments in future areas of growth and how you do that in a time of high unpredictability and disruption. Roger Spitz is here joining me for this conversation, who has spent time in the venture capital world and guides business leaders around future market conditions, leveraging modern business frameworks and strategic foresight. So we're going to talk about all of those things. A huge welcome to the show, Roger.
Wonderful to be on, Jared. Looking forward to it. Yeah, you have a broad set of guests and topics. I'm looking outside, so it's always fun.
It's going to be, I'm sure, a huge learning opportunity for me as well, diving into your work. So for anyone who knows less about you than I do, let's start with a quick intro into who Roger is.
I'm Roger Spitz. I'm born in South Africa, actually, and traveled quite a bit at different stages of my life. Professionally, spent quite some time in investment banking. So I was head of mergers and acquisitions technology for one of the large banks, advising CEOs, boards, and investors on their most strategic acquisitions or divestments. Doing that from London, covering globally, and then in 2017 moved to San Francisco to develop the M&A business here, and decided to go down the rabbit hole of change. So that led me to a dozen micro-learning courses over a few years, from futures and foresight, complexities, systems, improv, stand-up comedy, AI, exponential tech, anything that kind of helped me understand better change. Fast forward, that led me to decide 4 years ago, either a very wise or very stupid decision to move out of investment banking and to spend more time, full-time, on topics of understanding change. So within that, I'm interested in systemic change and how do you drive transformational change. And because of my M&A background, indeed, I have some focus on the investment world. So as a kind of caveat from my old life, I'm speaking today as a futures and foresight practitioner and not as an investment advisor, but it doesn't mean we can't talk about those topics.
You get some investment advice from Roger today. No, just joking. But it's such an interesting background. I think, what you are well known for and considered highly credible in is that kind of merging of those two topics is foresight and futures and business. And, particularly obviously M&A and business investments and new growth avenues, guiding companies and leaders and institutions towards better decisions around the future. Did you think that you would become one of the most well-known futurists?
Well, I don't know how well-known I am or not, but certainly compared to 5 years ago or 10 years ago, a little bit more. But I think it's an interesting thing because you look at the journey of a lot of us, you and many others, and we all have very different backgrounds. It reminds me of one of the Monty Python movies. We're all individuals, and then I'm not. I think it's Brian who raises his hand. But I didn't know. To be perfectly honest, I've only been kind of immersed in the field for a small single-digit number of years, less than 10. Probably a decade ago, even though I was in M&A, even though I was looking, forward and looking at disruption and change and that, and what I thought was strategy and long-term, the reality is that I didn't actually know it was a field. I didn't know what it entailed. I just thought it was either a buzzword or exclusively technocentric. I had no understanding of it. I stumbled upon it purely by accident 7 or 8 years ago, when my interest was on trying to understand strategy and change and value creation from even an M&A perspective and speaking to CEOs and that. I initially thought that they were looking long term, that they had a sense of strategy, that we took into account different things. But because I guess you could get away with the assumption of a stable, predictable, linear, and controllable world, effectively, the reality is that most of the world operates on that linear, stable, predictable assumption. And the price of getting it wrong wasn't huge. You could follow the playbook of increased market share or international expansion or broadening the portfolio with a new product or whatever. And it's only about, I'd say 6-7 years ago that I felt very strongly that change was changing in a more systemic way, that you couldn't isolate innovation or technology or these things, that playbooks weren't necessarily working, that what was keeping CEOs or shareholders up at night wasn't disruption in the technocentric Silicon Valley sense, but things that were more fundamental. In a sense, it was my quest to understand what was changing in change. How is disruption being disrupted? What is an updated view one should have on that? What is it to stay relevant when all this is happening? That I realized how many things intersect. What are the underlying drivers of change? And effectively stumbled upon futures and foresight as a field, which was an alternative to continuing to live on the wrong assumption of a stable, predictable, linear world, and the assumption which I felt it was costing more and more to rely on that wrong assumption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think you talk about it in the book, and a quick plug for the book right now, Disrupt with Impact. There it is.
Thank you.
Definitely worth a read for sure. There is a section in there where you do talk about this, I guess, false assumption that things are constant, that we're operating business as usual, but the cost of running a business as BAU is more expensive because things are not as usual. There is no constant. Disruption is the new constant, that business leaders and particularly CEOs should be thinking about new methods, tools, mindsets, skills to adapt to a world that is more unpredictable, that is more volatile, that has all of these factors that, while you can't predict them, you can better anticipate for them to make your business more resilient, I guess, and adaptable to this new market condition. But generally, CEOs and business leaders are still very much thinking in much shorter term lenses, right, which clouds them from that broader view of this highly disrupted world. I mean, is that fair in particularly the conversations that you have with business leaders now, so they are still very short-term focused?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, no doubt about that. Ultimately, the primary incentive for most businesses is quote unquote value creation. And especially for listed companies, that's pretty much a proxy for the share price. Now, things that drive upwards the share price are kind of pushed. The challenge, I guess, for businesses is in a nonlinear, complex, exponential world, the speed with things can suddenly turn, both for the opportunities, which is the value creation, and for the risks, which is the value destruction. And so I think what even the business world is starting to realize is when you take the combination of what we call meta-ruptions, the different possible changes and disruptions, and see how they interact and the speed with which they can interact, you're looking at trillions of dollars of redistribution of value, whether it's technology, climate, AI, literally trillions of dollars. So the question, by ignoring those changes and realizing that change is slow until it isn't, if you are not thoughtful around future preparedness, both for the resiliency and for the value opportunities, the sustainable value creation, which side of that value creation or value destruction are you going to be? So I think business leaders are starting to realize that through use cases. On the damage side, it's through climate or what have you, or geopolitical. On the plus side, it's the value creation for companies. I'm not saying societally or anything else, through AI or new technologies or drug discovery or what have you. So topics like decision-making in deep uncertainty, which felt a bit esoteric even as recently as 5 years ago. And with the pandemic and everything else that is happening, I think companies are starting to at least have the aha moment and the realization that the environment is different. Then the challenge is, what do you do about it? Do you believe you need different modes of thinking? And if you do, how do you go about it? And how do you instill that in terms of a mindset and not just a sort of, another playbook that doesn't necessarily work in unpredictable, complex environments? Or do you embed that more fundamentally? So you have, I think the aha moment is a little bit easier these days because of simply the volume of news flow and events happening, even in the business world. The challenge then is, do you believe you actually are already doing it naively and wrongly? Do you believe that you need to do it? If so, how? And then do you do it effectively, or are you just doing it? Yeah, which is why the book is actually called Disrupt the Impact. Impact is how do you make sure it's effective as opposed to just happening. It doesn't mean it's effective.
And help you to consider what are you doing in that context to be more effective
Yeah.
in that kind of environment. Because I know that you make this distinction in the book about business leaders, you know, and they feel overwhelmed. I mean, we've seen this in so many industry reports, but like the PwC report is my favorite to quote, that, you know, almost half of all CEOs are feeling that their business is not going to last for the next decade. Why? Because of these long-term factors that make them feel like they don't quite know where to place their bets in a way. But there's a difference between the unforeseeable, is as you put it in the book, right? The things that feel like they just like literally come out of nowhere. The world is so chaotic and so wicked at the moment, it feels like. And these feelings are all, you know, valid. The feelings of being overwhelmed as a leader with the amount of chaos in the world is valid. But then the difference between that and poor decision making, so not actually thinking through what the implications and the consequences of the things that are unfolding in the world might be and planning for them. So it's almost like you're flagging an active, intentional state of ignorance in a way, not to be harsh, and like recognizing the situation that we're in, but taking really active and intentional steps to do something about it, to prepare for it.
No, it's really interesting the way you framed it, because part of the overwhelming nature for decision makers is the inability to know what to bet on. And it brings us both, and I know you're very passionate about these topics and as well, around the mindset, which is, am I trying to find the answer and get the next bet right, versus what are the questions I should be asking myself? How do I build resiliency, and how do I see the world? What worldview do I have? What assumptions do I make that are going to allow me to prepare better and respond better to even the unexpected? And the difference between unintended consequences versus unexpected consequences or unanticipated. There are things you can anticipate and there are things that just happen. But the way you see the world, the assumptions you make are going to inform how you prepare and how you respond. And with that, the opportunities you either stumble upon or not. And so that's really the difference, in a sense, between some of the more conventional strategy and I guess the foresight, where you accept the indeterminacy, you accept that you're looking for questions as opposed to answers, you're accepting different, next order implications, you're accepting a degree of ambiguity and uncertainty, and it doesn't necessarily allow you to prepare less well or with less clarity. I'd actually think you gain clarity by having that reality check, but obviously different. So that's really fascinating the way you frame that, because that is the challenge. When you're looking for the right answer and the next bet, of course, you're not going to find it in a deeply uncertain world, which is unpredictable. So you're looking for the wrong thing.
Yeah, or maybe you're at that point, you're more driven by emotions as well, and an intuition based on your experience versus really kind of weighing the data or the evidence of the future a little bit more. But that's where I think, going back to your point about, discovering foresight, is that it gives you those frameworks to be able to do that, which is, those modern frameworks for the modern world that we're now living in, that has that higher level of disruption and unpredictability. And so I think, one of the frameworks that I really love that you've created is it the AAA? Is that what you've coined it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Love that. So anti-fragile, anticipatory, and agility. And the way that I will probably not describe it as well as you will in a minute is that, firstly, anti-fragile, you're trying to give your business a strong immune system, which I love, right? It's like, what is that foundational kind of input that you're putting into your business to make sure that it can be more resilient for an unpredictable world? Anticipatory, so everything you just touched on before, where you're thinking about those intended or unintended consequences. and then agility to be able to leverage those opportunities for new investments. And what I love particularly in this is that you talk about leveraging things like curiosity, creativity, experimentation, and imagination.
It's interesting because sometimes, I feel an inferiority complex around people who are maybe more academic in terms of foresight, who have been, involved for longer. But it does allow us to have a fresh eye as well when you're a newbie. And I love in Eastern philosophy this idea of beginner's mind, shoshin. In the beginner's mind, everything is possible. In the eye, if you're a master or an expert, know all the reasons why something can't be done. And when I first came to foresight, to be honest, I fell in love with the idea and the methods and the tools, and I still am. But I found the field slightly dogmatic sometimes. I felt, you had, I wouldn't say a camp, but certain people for whom you felt scenarios and longer term thinking was absolutely essential and the be all and end all. But then other people who maybe rightly or not, it's not for me to say, but who felt actually only the present exists. You need to emerge in the here and now. I just couldn't understand why these had to be either or decisions and what were the tools to deal with both of them. Okay, anticipatory is the foresight tools, the scenario, and I think you're certainly extraordinarily well versed, and many of your listeners may be as well. And that led me to think about agility, not in the sense that it's often used in innovation and disruption and that, but really the agility to reconcile longer term visions with the emergence in the here and now. But not like I'm fighting emergencies. Emergence in the sense that I've asked myself the right questions, I've anticipated, I've built certain scenarios, I've built resiliency. But in the end, only the present exists. I need to emerge in the here and now, amplify what seems to be working, dampen what doesn't. It's a discovery process. It's unknown unknowns. I can't rely on experts for the answer at that point in time because it's unknown. And that emergent trial and error discovery process needs imagination, needs all things. But you don't want to disconnect it from things that can be anticipated and from the longer term vision. So that agility for me is a cognitive, emergent, and strategic agility to reconcile the here and the now decision making with the longer term vision you're preparing for and aspiring to and driving towards. But then once you've done that, it's like, and this is when I discovered the work of Nassim Taleb, maybe just under a decade ago, and the Incerto series, and in particular Anti-Fragility, but not only Skin in the Game, and all of his work is absolutely essential. But Anti-Fragility in particular, which was like, okay, but you need foundations that are resilient. And to discover that you could try and aspire to having things that are more than just resilient. I mean, we do it in climate, for instance, the difference between conservation and preservation. We've been working on a project in Brazil where we're actually applying the AAA and anti-fragility. You could aspire to ticking the box and to preserving things as they are and to not destroying forestation or whatever, or you could actually build virtuous ecosystems which improves. And that's conservation versus preservation, which is a form of anti-fragility versus resiliency. And so this anti-fragility is like, instead of having an elastic or rubber band, which fine, it's resilient to shocks and it doesn't deform and that, but it doesn't necessarily improve. And so I was fascinated by putting together these three elements, which are the foundations. Whatever happens, there are certain things that are more fragile and certain things that are more resilient or ideally anti-fragile. Anticipatory for long-term thinking and the agility. And then what I add to what enables us to be AAA is basically agency. Agency is important because it's like an option. Unless you exercise it, nothing happens. So you need agency in the philosophical sense and, human sense of doing something. So that for me is basically something which we use a lot in real world examples, from climate to other things to drive change.
So agency, I think, in a way, is a little bit of survival. So what can I do? What's in the realm of my control to be able to make my business continue to, survive or thrive? But then also agency is tapping into an acceptance and maybe a lost confidence that we create the future with the decisions that we're making, the choices we're making. So we can just choose the alternative or the substitute option for certain things, or we can create something new. So I love that you feed agency into that. And agency, I guess, also links really nicely with what you mentioned before around Shoshin. Is that how you said it?
Shoshin, yeah.
Shoshin.
I'm actually not sure it's the
Love
correct
that.
pronunciation. I say Shoshin, but
Shoshin sounds good. Yeah, Zen Buddhism concept. I know you wrote about this a little bit in the book. I was actually hoping you had like a whole philosophy section in the book, so maybe that's the
for the
next
future.
the future edition. But the beginner's mindset of accepting that there is a negative, I guess, to our expertise, and that sometimes our expertise and our perceived knowledge on something, or the perceived kind of playbook by which we lived and ran our businesses, is maybe setting us back because it's not allowing us to tap into that, what you said before, the agency to create something new, this permission that we need to give
Yeah,
ourselves.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in your reactions because you're right. These are words which are powerful, which build in storytelling. And one of the most important words I like that you just used is also choice, right? Choosing. And the reason why I had been interested in philosophy when I studied as a kid in the French system, I spent a few years. You touch upon philosophy even, before your matric or baccalaureate or whatever one calls it. But I didn't study it in a deep, meaningful way at university because I went a bit capitalistic and selfish and just went into investment banking, as many people do in cities like London or New York. But it's only later when I got into complexity and systems and thinking about indeterminacy that I reconciled with philosophy and worked with a guy called Rowley, who's a PhD in philosophy, to test basically the following. When I worked and discovered with some of the course I did at Santa Fe Institute and some of the work of Dave Snowden and, with this Kinnovan framework and that, the distinction between complicated and complex. So for those who are less familiar with it, the distinction is important and it's directly connected to a lot of what we're talking about. Complicated is something which you understand how to do. You have a range of right answers. There are known unknowns. It's linear and predictable. You can know ex ante, if you take a course of action, what the outcome will be. So how do you send a probe to Mars? How do you fix a jet engine? These things are not easy. I certainly can't do it, but we understand how to do it. Science can do it. And AI is quite good with that, and humans are good with that. And their expertise and science and that is absolutely invaluable because that is the basis. Now, the challenge is in areas which are complex as opposed to complicated, where there are unknown unknowns, where it's non-linear, so unpredictable, where the outcomes cannot be understood or known ex ante, where there's no range of right answers at that point in time. It's emergent, and therefore it has to be a trial and error and discovery process. It has to be diverse perspectives to come up with an answer. And there you need imagination, you need agency, you need indeterminacy, you need uncertainty. They're actually a good thing, and you could argue that it's actually positive because if everything were predetermined, you'd have no choice, agency, or freedom on anything. The word you used, Joe, a moment ago, freedom. So the reality is that indeterminacy and this link with beginner's mind and Shoshin is not to dismiss science and experts. I know this is a very unhealthy debate around that these days through polarization. Of course, science is essential. It's extraordinary the speed with which we came up with vaccines for COVID, and all those are just simply miracles. But in some of our problems and complex challenges, there's no plug and play. Experience and expertise at this juncture per se is not going to resolve it because of these unknown unknowns and unpredictability of that. And this is where you need different modes, and you need to recognize those situations or environments which have those features and for which Shoshin, agency, beginner's mind, trial and error, imagination are not only helpful, but prerequisites.
Well, it's interesting, when you were talking, it kind of made me think this might be tasked to a person in a business to tackle, which is a hard task in and of itself, right? Like if you're kind of there in the business to help organizational leaders to get their heads around all of this, and you're giving them the permission maybe to separate the things that are complex and complicated, which is, I think, really helpful, particularly as a starting point for all of this. But then you're also pushing them to think about the agency that they hold inside of a probably regulated system that governs their lives, right? Their income, their livelihoods, and the future growth of the business. Usually that person is playing quite a provocative role. Andy Hines wrote about this a little while ago. He said that this person would be essentially putting their career at stake in every conversation they have with business leaders, because you have to push people into very uncomfortable places. And I know that you wrote about this fairly recently. There's a section in the book where you talk about this kind of the role of somebody in an organization to be able to do that. I guess my question is, in a very roundabout way, we are creating lots of new roles in organizations. I mean, you have generally a chief strategy officer or sometimes a chief M&A officer. You certainly have now roles that come and go, like a chief AI officer. But generally, there's no room for somebody in an organization that has that more philosophical mindset, that provocative mindset, provides those frameworks at that higher level. Certainly you have foresight leaders and risk and intelligence leaders that employ foresight. But that role would be much more, I guess, harder to quantify the impact that they're having. So I guess is one way around this to be able to link it into future investments and to be able to help the business to quantify some of those growth opportunities that you're giving them the push and the agency to act on. Should that be the way that we're thinking about this?
So a lot of very good thoughts, and I didn't find it roundabout at all, because it's through the different perspectives that you kind of get a sense of some of the problematics. And, for you, I think it's very interesting when I listen to you and hear the question, given your own, how you spent many years within big organizations to try and drive change and capabilities and capacity building for some of these things. So I should be asking you the question as well, for sure. And I would be interested in your reactions on that. But I think they're different things, right? So I think there's indeed the idea of, is there a kind of role like that, and what would that role be? I think we're past the day, and again, very interested in your thoughts on that, but I think we're past the time where we can kind of rely on a particular way of thinking or person or mode to bring in information or playbook or sounding board. I think we're now in environments where you need to build capacity for sense making and decision making in deep uncertainty, in systemic disruption, and in these environments. And whether that comes through certain people, departments, recruiting differently from board to leadership teams to even the entire day-to-day operational and strategic teams, ultimately, it's really how do you build capacity for that in an organization, in society, and that. And I think that's really important. And through that, the right recruitments and talent and development allows change makers to try and amplify that capacity building. But ultimately, you need to build the capacity for that. I do it myself quite a bit with boards, for instance, and organizations, which are, understanding that it's not a playbook, that it's not just recruiting a specific position. You're right. In the book, I do introduce, like chief existential officer and chief bridging officers. But fundamentally, it's more, I wouldn't say tongue-in-cheek, but it's more illustrative of the kind of role one has, but with the view of being a kind of change maker, multiply effect to build the capacity for that. And you need it at all levels. I would say one of the most interesting projects I had, which I'm kind of under NDA, so I can't disclose the organization, but it's quite a large organization, which realized that, yes, it helps to have their top 20 or top 30 or however they label leadership teams involved and build these new, what I call operating systems. But ultimately, you need to find a way of having it flow down in the system, because coming back to fragile versus anti-fragile, command and control, hierarchical, structured, and centralized are probably more fragile than anti-fragile, which is decentralized, emergent, etc. And when you look at decision making and sense making, if you're relying on one person, one department, one level of seniority, you're probably going to have an issue, because these changes we're talking about in environments don't affect just a particular door or level of, or the 20th floor or title. So that's one thought, and love your reactions, because you're facing that kind of every day in a way that's very insightful, I'm sure. And then the other consideration is, are we looking at it purely for investment and for measuring and for the performance and the KPIs or the internal rate of return? And there you come back to a broader debate whether, there's no data on the future and what is the value. Is that kind of just looking at the rear view mirror? Is that kind of the trend analysis and some of things? Or do we need to get comfortable that we're in environments where things are asymmetrical, the amplitude and speed with which both value can be destroyed or created mean that you need certain modes, and whether it's for investments, innovation, or whatever it is, which go beyond just the sort of way we approach investments and measurability. And that is a challenging thing for organizations to get their head around.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's definitely a key point, if not the key point, is that everything in an organization needs to be measurable, right? I mean, even if you're just tracking progress, you're still tracking against something. Even, a lot of the times businesses will employ these new innovation processes that are, to your point before, agile, and even they need stage gates, they need milestones, they have targets. So I guess a business is maybe rightly obsessed with measuring things and making sure that it's on the right track by having usually a quantifiable metric that it can hold itself up to, and obviously for shareholders to know that we're spending money appropriately. So that's maybe not a bad thing, but I think what's interesting in what you said is that if companies are moving or should be moving to more decentralized models or less hierarchical structures, it means that the voices of decision are now more with individuals than teams, I guess, individuals at various levels, and that mistakes will be made. Going back to the very start of our conversation, that the future is less predictable. And I love what you said, there is no date on the future. I think that's awesome. It's very true. It's again our obsession with like setting a date for when the future will come and we'll hit this, milestone of our targets. But also that, I guess going back again to what we were saying about philosophy, and I wrote this down as well, you said it in the book, that Western philosophy favors perfection, Eastern imperfection. If we're allowing more individuals, more decentralization in our processes, it means that we have to have some tolerance for maybe not things to not go right or according to target, but that we're really truly treating things as a learning opportunity. Yeah. So actually, even though I'm so sorry, I feel like my questions are just meandering all over the place, I feel like all of these things are actually really interconnected.
They are. And again, if I may unpack some things you said, because the meandering is actually very insightful reactions, which are worth touching upon, because I think there's magic and very significant insights in what you've said. So the one you've touched upon, which is so important, is the idea of mistakes, right, and tolerance. The challenge, again, came back to the distinction with complicated and complex, is that in complicated, there are mistakes. If you're a heart surgeon and you cut off someone's leg, I guess that's, you can sort of say it's a learning or discovery process. But if you're the patient, you might sort of feel, well, kind of, So the challenge is with things are complex, which are unpredictable, indeterminate, unknown unknowns. Effectively, you need mistakes because it's a discovery process. You need to test things to amplify what's working and dampen what isn't. And I'm not saying you can't be thoughtful around, it's not an excuse to not anticipate things that could have been anticipated. I'm really talking about genuine challenges, like, we have AI, technologies, new education models, because we know or should know that our education isn't working. Climate, some of these things, it's not that they're not science-led and that we know, we don't know precisely how to resolve everything. If we did, we probably wouldn't be in this mess. For some of the topics, geopolitical, societal. So the challenges in complex, you need some degree of emergence and trial and error. And it's actually a feature. Without that, you're unlikely to resolve this. And, not to be too philosophical, but Toynbee has done a lot of work in history and observed that a lot of the civilizations which collapse, Maya or Incas or what have you, often do so because humanity wasn't able to resolve some of our most complex challenges. And so the question is, are we at these inflection points as humanity or as an organization for its own existential risk where it's not allowing the trial and error and discovery and mistakes, if you can call it that, but if there are no right answers at that point in time, if you need a discovery process to, effectively it's not a mistake. The way I look at it is the following. Initially, you had a lot of convergence of technologies and things. And so people would sort of say, oh, let's bet on this, which has a bit of AI and a bit of whatever. And then they realized that the value chains are moving. So first you have convergence, and then you have the intersections of things. So for instance, take chip manufacturing. Companies started realizing that actually the breakthroughs in AI weren't just coming through software or algorithms, but actually through the hardware. And that's with the neural networks, and that's why Google and the likes started building and developing and producing their own chips because they realized that. And then you realize that the value of a car is probably now, I'm just inventing a number, but it could be in the future 60, 70, 80% of the value of a car could be a chip and its operating system, whereas historically, the car's not software. So you have these shifts in the value chain and this convergence. But coming back to the analogy with complicated and complex and emergence and trial and error, what you're having now is emergence is creating new fields. So you have, lab printed food, maybe diamonds, maybe other kinds of crazy materials technology. You have CRISPR with gene editing, which is life-changing. You have companies like Ginkgo Bioworks, which is basically a horizontal platform for cell programming. You might have living clothes, semiconductors with bees or bee pollen or whatever. And these things that seem like science fiction, it's not that I'm trying to be Silicon Valley or technocentric. The point I'm making is that a lot of the value creation opportunities are going to come not from things that you can measure and understand today, but things that are emergent, things that are the intersection of fields that don't have a name, that don't have competitors, that don't have a market share, that can't be measured and understood. When you can do that, you look at a trend report and you're looking at a rearview mirror. But these emergent fields, why is it that Dennis Hassabis, the deep learning part of Google, won a Nobel Prize and his team basically for chemistry? And it's an AI company because of drug discovery and AlphaFold and protein and unpacking and all these things at the intersection of materials science and drug discovery and all kinds of things. And these are emergent fields that didn't even exist some time ago. So the challenge with the measurability and the trial and error or the mistakes is that when you look at things that are emergent and that don't actually exist or have a label, what is a mistake? You're kind of trying some new things that actually, yes, there's a lot of harm coming from some discoveries and technology, but some others are very hopeful, drug discovery, all kinds of other things.
Yeah, and you've just listed a ton of areas that are seeing not only, disruption, to use the word of the day, but, is there a completely different way that we should be assessing the value of this thing? The car analogy, I think, is a really great one, that the car is now your fourth device. It's no longer just a transport vehicle or mode of mobility. So I think it's really interesting for us inside of the business world to also apply that to our own industry and category. It's kind of jobs to be done is comparing yourself against really what job is your product doing. Yeah. But even beyond that, thinking into the future, how is the world evolving, and therefore what role will your category or your industry play in that future that might be completely different? Yeah. So I think it's such great food for thought. So I guess because you do get obviously exposed to so many different industries and categories, I guess I'm wondering what's your eye on at the moment? What are you excited about in a specific sector or industry that's growing or doing interesting and exciting things?
One thing that I think is really extraordinary is a lot of the work around drug discovery and, understanding the DNA structures and protein and I'm personally not one of those kind of, longevity and will live till 300 and, but I do see that the ability, if you're able to cure things that so far we haven't been able to, if you're able to reduce the drug discovery process from 4 or 5 years to 1 year to 6 months, if you're able to try, billions of permutations, which are complicated. We understand how the body works. We can test these things. It's not complex like, what the hell. This is where science and potentially technology should be good at. And humans, of course. And I think there's an area as well, which is kind of linked around materials technology. I spend a lot of time around, climate situations. And again, I'm not talking about the plug and play, venture capital where we're going to just find a new material or capture carbon. I think we need to rethink the fundamentals as industries and society. It's not a dating app where turn left and resolve the climate. It's not so simple. These are complex challenges to scale on that. But I do think that some areas around materials technology are very promising if you can produce things in different ways, biomimicry, natural algae, a lot of things in urban development, things that Europe is developing for real estate and urban developments and cities. So we forget sometimes how much cement alone is probably one of the biggest culprits, right, for carbon emissions. So if you have a net zero cement, it probably doesn't hurt if you can do that cost effectively at scale, et cetera, or 3D printing certain things. So I think there are a lot of these things that are positive, whether you look at it from a societal perspective, from a kind of potential investment perspective, I guess. Of course, the challenge, and maybe just to wrap up, is it's not for everybody. Many of these will not fall through. And then there's a question about, like some of the challenges like climate, when you have long-term horizons, different capital structures, when you have infrastructure plus hardware plus software, venture capital likes easy plug and play things. To your point, they like measurable, they like it tangible. Maybe they're prepared to wait a few years. So this is where the challenge for investments and returns and anything, innovation, is who underwrites the check. And this is, I think Europe should be the one much better than it is, because I think they think longer term, they think institutionally between government, corporations, and public and private, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, a lot of really interesting examples there. And I think, you touched on something which, to wrap up, sums everything up really nicely, particularly your point about some of these things being very emergent. Sometimes maybe it's not the right time to invest in them, but it's definitely the right time to pay attention to them. Mm-hmm. And I wrote down this quote that you wrote in the book, which I love: understanding the limits of our vision is not the same as accepting them. So open your vision and your scope and your perspective to broader things and understand how the world is evolving. It definitely pays in many ways. So thank you so much for coming on the show and talking through all of that, Roger. I do have one final question before I let you go, which is what your go-to is when you're wanting yourself to get a fresh perspective and to look outside.
Yeah, so like many of these complex things, it's difficult to have just one go-to. But I would say, coming back to what's complex, there's no right answer. You can't find the right expert. So you need things that are different perspectives. So one thing I did, for instance, with our guidebooks and at the Institute, I stumbled upon Lydia Zwin, who was decades younger than me, which isn't difficult, and who is in Brazil and who comes from a more humanistic and background and interests. And Lydia's phenomenal, writes and lives science fiction, and she's phenomenal. And, she was, I don't know if kind is the word, but thoughtful enough to kind of work with me on some of the guidebooks and some of our work. And that, for me, was my go-to to looking outside, to come back to your podcast, which is someone who has completely different references, completely different everything. And having that person or voice, and then like many of us, we probably just don't have one go-to. So I read too much and a lot of things, which I hope many are not just echo chambers.
Yeah, reading too much is definitely a good problem to have. And I love that go-to. If you're going to initiate something, partner with somebody who has a different background, different field of experience, maybe different part of the world to you. I think that's awesome. So Roger, this whole conversation, I think we're going to have to do a part 2. Maybe we can do it in Leipzig, Germany.
Yes, maybe. That'd be amazing. Amazing.
To be continued. But yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
No, thanks so much for doing everything you do, Joe. The podcast is amazing, and so is your work on that. So thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, or share the show, and I will see you next time. Until then, keep looking outside.